Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History of the United States. I'm Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriot's History of the United States with Michael Allen. And yes, I am going to get to the updated edition, the last chapter, the last 5 years, but we have it out being reviewed. I'm making sure that there's no errors in it. Might just finish reviewing it. I'm thinking I might not put this up till March as we start the new season. It's a little late to incorporate it this year into your curriculum. Have to make some changes, so we'll see, but I still don't have it back from the editor yet at any rate. Okay, so we were in chapter 5, which is Small Republic, Big Shoulders. And we were looking at the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton. And so again, I am, as always, reading from the 15th anniversary edition. So you'll want to make sure you have this up at the top. And earlier editions, the headers will probably match, but the page numbers won't. So I am on page 146, last paragraph. A third report. So just to catch you up, remember, Hamilton's first report was on assumption of all the debts. That is, the U.S. government would assume and pay off all of the debts of all the states, any debt of the Congress that was incurred during the American Revolution. And Hamilton's thinking on this was, we're going to pay them off to the to the person who holds the debt now, legally. Couldn't have stolen it. But if you paid for it as a speculator, didn't matter, because you were the one who took the risk in saying, I believe the United States is going to make it. So Hamilton's view was that those people should be paid off. And all of them should be paid off. So the U.S. would never start its life being in the hole. Second one was the report on a national bank. And with this kind of went funding. Hamilton's idea was to ditch the state funding that was in the Constitution's 3/5 clause, where a slave would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of, not 3/5 of a person, 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and taxation. Well, they never got around to doing the taxation part, because our import duties, which are going to be covered by Madison's third point, his third plan, and land sales suffice to present the government with plenty of money. And as we discussed last time, Hamilton sets up a bank to handle all this money. It's a private bank, 4/5 owned privately, but it could issue notes. And it issued banknotes or money all around the country, because it had 12 branches originally, different states. And so this money became kind of a circulating medium for everybody. At that time, there were no state banks, state chartered banks. There will be a lot of them after 1804, but at that time there were none. What we're going to see later is that these state chartered banks can, by law, print their own money. So let's say you have 10 state chartered banks in North Carolina. What money do you use? You use the money that has the most value, that is recognized more places. Can you use it in Virginia? Not easily. It's possible, but not easily. Why? Virginia's got its own banks. They're using their own banknote money. So the Bank of the United States having note issue power meant that its money, its notes, could travel around and circulate and be used in any state in the Union with confidence. Because if you didn't know the First Bank of Virginia and you were in Connecticut, you knew the Bank of the United States in Connecticut. And so it became kind of a clearinghouse for interstate finance and interstate commerce. It was very important. It had great trust because everybody trusted the money because they knew it could be used everywhere. Somebody in South Carolina who used a South Carolina bank's money could not be assured that that money would be used or accepted in Pennsylvania or New York. So the second part of Hamilton's assumption and funding and Bank of the United States aspect was that we would have debt. We would have a national debt because that's how you build up credit. Remember, I talked about this last time. When your kid goes away to college, you get them a credit card, but it has a very low limit. You need to make sure they can use a credit card responsibly. They don't go put a Ferrari on a credit card. But as they show they are trustworthy, you increase their limit more and more and more. Same thing with our country. Our country needed to have a growing credit card limit because we might have need for more money being loaned to us at a time. But the only way you the only way you generated that credit was to be trustworthy. And the only way you became trustworthy was to have loans and pay them off. I'm sure you know today, you adults, that we have something called a credit score, a FICO score. Well, it turns out if you pay off a credit card too quickly, like you get a brand new credit card and you charge $100 worth of stuff and you pay it right off, you never charge anything else. Or you get an auto loan, this is even better, you get an auto loan and you pay it off in 3 months. That actually hurts your FICO score because they want to see a pattern that you are capable of paying over time, not just all at once. Could be you had a windfall, could be you went to Vegas and hit the jackpot, whatever. But they want to see that, okay, over time, Julie can pay this money back. All right. Same thing with Hamilton and his loans. So he and Congress established a sinking fund, very important, we don't have today, which was you can't have Congress borrow more money until it has paid off its last loan. If we had that today, we would have no big national debt. We would have no big interest rates. All right, we're ready to continue now. A third report, the Report on Manufactures, December 1791, proved significant mainly as a portent of things to come. Congress rejected this ambitious neo-mercantilist plan. Hamilton, keenly aware of the significance of the burgeoning Industrial Revolution, sought a departure from the market disciplines he had invoked in his earlier reports. Without question, Hamilton was one of the few Americans who fully understood the impact of capitalists' rapidly accelerating use of technology, capital, labor, raw materials, transportation, and global markets to create wealth. In this, the stodgy Adams wholeheartedly agreed, noting, property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. Hamilton, however, went beyond merely protecting private property. He called on America to immediately accelerate its own industrial revolution, particularly to ensure the nation could manufacture arms, boots, uniforms, and implements of war if needed. Typically, he hurled himself into the project visiting or writing manufacturers, obtaining data and details of their production processes, then finally acquiring samples, which he spread out on a table for Congress to examine, quote, like a small trade fair, an altogether new form of lobbying. While his motivation was laudable, for all of his foresight in other matters, Hamilton looked backward to a mercantilism to accomplish these ends. He advocated protective tariffs and federal bounties, subsidies to incubate industry. Neither of the British finance ministers, Townsend or Pitt, would have criticized such policies. In style, anticipating Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt, Hamilton wrote, quote, "The public purse must supply the deficiency of private resources." Anti-Federalists and even some Federalists reacted to Hamilton's 3 reports with utter amazement. In some specifics, the White Papers recommended the creation of a system that they deemed suspiciously similar to mercantilism Americans had just overthrown, and the latter report sparking Madison's immediate and crucial defection to the anti-Federalist cause. Southerners, Westerners, agrarians, and small government men everywhere were rallied to challenge the secretary. Madison represented Virginia and had already paid off its debts. Why, asked congressmen from the solvent states, should they subsidize the lax federal policies of the indebted states? Moreover, why should they reward bondholders, stock jobbers, as some farmers called them, who had bought cheap during the nation's crisis and now demanded payment at par? Further, Madison argued the Constitution in no way authorized funding assumption and a permanent national debt. A compromise temporarily settled this dispute over a permanent national debt. At a dinner party sponsored by Jefferson and with Madison in attendance, Hamilton surrendered on the location of the national capital. At least this partly concluded those behind the scenes negotiations, which had been conducted for months. By agreeing to move the capital to Philadelphia and ultimately to the Virginia-Maryland border in a separate district of Columbia, Hamilton gained the support of Southerners anxious to see the seat of government located in their neck of the woods. Philadelphia relented in part because Pennsylvania congressmen thought once they had the capital, even for a while, it would never move. An attempt to move the location of government, said one representative in an ill-fated prophecy, will be generally viewed as a mere political maneuver with no more credibility than inserting Mississippi, Detroit, and Winnipocket Pond. As matters turned out, the apparent advantage Madison had extracted in the bargain for Virginia not only proved illusory, namely that over time, Virginia exerted virtually no extraordinary control over the nation's political affair, but by the late 20th century, the District of Columbia would be home to many federal employees beholden to the federal government, like Virginia's own state elections for governor, were controlled largely by the counties most affected by federal largesse. Okay, and that's up there in Fairfax County. Thus, instead of the Old Dominion capturing D.C., Washington captured Virginia. I need to elaborate on this because this is really important. The idea was that by putting the capital in Virginia, a District of Columbia, Virginians would be able to go there in person, ride there, walk there, and lobby Congress for Virginia stuff. Could lobby Congress for policies that would benefit Virginians. But over time, what happened was that as the federal government grew so much, federal employees spread out all over Northern Virginia, Fairfax County especially, and settled and made their homes there, but they weren't tied to Virginia. They weren't, they didn't have their allegiance to Virginia. Their allegiance was to who paid them, which was the federal government. So this was a terrible mistake by Madison and Jefferson, made out of selfishness to try to get this capital where they could lobby the capital. And over time, as I said, it took 200 years, but now Virginia is pretty much a Democrat state, largely because of the federal government numbers in Northern Virginia. Southern Virginia is, of course, highly Republican, and Western Virginia, which is overwhelmingly Republican, split off during the Civil War to become West Virginia. So until we can do something about the federal government and its size and scope, Virginia, even when it elects a Republican like Glenn Youngkin by a slim margin, Virginia is going to remain substantially a Democrat state. All right. In some specifics, the white papers recommended the creation they deemed suspiciously similar to the mercantilism Americans had just overthrown, with the latter report sparking Madison's immediate crucial defection to the anti-federalist cause. Southerners, Westerners, agrarians, small government men everywhere rallied to challenge the secretary. Madison represented Virginia, which had already paid off its debts. Why, asked congressmen from solvent states, should they subsidize the lax federal policies of the indebted states? Moreover, why should they reward bondholders, stock jobbers, as farmers call them, who had bought cheap during the nation's crisis, now demanded payment at par? Further, Madison argued the Constitution in no way authorized federal assumption and a permanent national debt. A compromise temporarily settled this dispute over a permanent national debt. At a dinner party sponsored by Jefferson and with Madison in attendance, Hamilton surrendered on the location. Okay, we read this. All right. As matters turned out, the apparent advantage Madison had extracted in the bargain for Virginia not only proved illusory, namely, over time, Virginia exerted virtually no extraordinary control over the nation's political affairs, but by the late 20th century, the District of Columbia would be home to many federal employees. Okay, I read that. In the winter of 1791, Jefferson publicly joined Madison in opposing the Bank of the United States. Planters and farming folk were known for their anti-banking prejudices. One Southerner wrote that he deemed entering a bank as disgraceful as entering a house of ill repute. They decried what they perceived as bankers feeding at the public trough. Despite later constitutional arguments against the bank, a congressional debate on the Bank of the United States at the time produced few concerns about the constitutionality of the administration. Hamilton countered that the BUS was, quote, necessary and proper, Article 1, Section 8, to carry out the enumerated powers of taxation, coining of money, and commercial regulation. He didn't mean the bank should tax, he meant the bank should be able to hold tax revenue. Hamilton's argument of implied powers that if the end, taxation and so forth, is constitutional, then the means of achieving that end is too, would become extremely important in the years to come. Jefferson countered that the necessary and proper included only powers indispensable to carrying out the enumerated duties. He's right. But on this count, he met defeat. Despite Southern opposition, both houses of Congress voted to create a BUS and chartered it for 20 years. It would fall to James Madison and later Andrew Jackson's administration to renew the ongoing battle over the BUS. Okay, we'll do one more section. Feuding patriots. By the end of 1791, America had harvested a bumper crop from the seeds of partisan political dispute. Adding to Southern opposition to Hamilton's program, a strong protesting voice arose from frontiersmen in western Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and the new frontier settlements of the Ohio Valley. In those places, frontiersmen rallied around the cause of Jefferson, forging a Southern-Western alliance that would affect national politics for more than a generation. Westerners were outraged by Hamilton's initial fiscal policies and later by his whiskey tax, a measure aimed to subsidize debt assumption by taxing Western corn products at 25%. In this case, again, Hamilton stood on weak economic ground. He primarily urged Washington to enforce the tax to demonstrate the federal government's ultimate taxation authority. It contained a flexing of federal muscle that was unnecessary and immature. By levying these excise taxes on one of the most untaxed and unregulated groups in America, frontier farmers, Hamilton sparked a firestorm of opposition. The most economic life in the West revolved around corn. Corn whiskey even served as a medium of exchange in cash-short territories. Many farmers lacked cash at all, using whiskey as their currency. Protesting the tax, furious Westerners resorted to violence, just like the Shazites before them. Riots erupted in the Pittsburgh region, Kentucky, and Carolina backcountry, and even Maryland. Led by David Bradford and James Marshall, These self-styled whiskey rebels terrorized tax collectors, closed down courts, and threatened to invade Pittsburgh. When President Washington offered amnesty for surrender, the rebels rejected the offer. The Whiskey Rebellion marked a critical juncture for the new Federalist government. Unless it was crushed, Washington believed, quote, we can bid adieu to all government in this country except mob and club government. He added, quote, if the laws are to be trampled upon with immunity, then there is an end put with one stroke to Republican government. Can we not say that today? Do we have a system where, for one party, laws are not enforced, where they are met with impunity, trampled upon with impunity? Is Hunter Biden in jail yet? And for the other party, people are jailed right and left, indicted right and left. In August, Washington sent Hamilton to lead a 13,000-man army, larger than the Continental Army, to crush the rebels. With this show of force, the rebel cause instantly evaporated. Bradford, Marshall, and others bid a hasty retreat by flatboat down the Ohio River. Although courts convicted 2 whiskey rebels of treason, Washington magnanimously pardoned them both in July of 1795. Washington and Hamilton took pride in their decisive action. The Federalists had proven the ability of the new government to enforce the law. In the process, however, they handed the Republicans a political victory. Many Revolutionary-era Americans were alarmed at the sight of an American standing army moving against a ragged band of Pennsylvania farmers, fellow Americans no less. Rightly or wrongly, the Republicans saw the uncanny resemblance between the Whiskey Rebellion and the Patriot stamp and tea tax revolts of the Revolutionary era. Federalists rightly feared new frontier states would bolster Jefferson's support in Congress, and they opposed the statehood of these new territories. A compromise exchanged statehood for Kentucky with that of Vermont in 1791, but Tennessee proved to be an entirely different matter. In 1796, Federalists vainly threw roadblocks in front of the statehood drive, arguing that Tennessee's census and constitution were problematic and that the state was, quote, just one more twig in the electioneering cabal of Mr. Jefferson, unquote. Despite this arch-Federalist opposition, Tennessee entered the Union in time to cast its 1796 electoral votes for Jefferson and send a young Jeffersonian, Andrew Jackson, to Congress. Meanwhile, by the start of Washington's second term in office, the Hamilton-Jefferson feud had spun out of control, well past the point of resolution. Worse, their political differences only exacerbated an obvious personality conflict between these 2 young lions. Washington's cabinet meetings lost civility as the men settled into a pattern of continued verbal sparring and political one-upmanship. When not debating in person, they maneuvered in congressional caucuses and cloakrooms, or sniped by letter to acquaintances before finally ceasing speaking to each other altogether, resorting to firing anonymous newspaper editorials. Jefferson initially clung to the hope that the president's even-handedness would ultimately manifest itself in public policy. Employing his considerable skills of persuasion to lobby the president, Jefferson urged Washington to break from Hamilton, or at least blend some of Madison's and his own ideas into the Federalist policy mix. Continually thwarted on the domestic front, Jefferson might have endured had he not been so often overruled in his own area of expertise, foreign affairs. Over the course of Washington's first term, the Secretary of State saw his foreign policy aims slowly erode under Hamilton's assaults, and it was in the arena of foreign policy where the disagreements reached their most vindictive stage. And so we'll stop right there on page 149. Next time we'll take up with Beyond the Oceans and Mountains. And I will see you guys back here. Remember, we're trying to make Patriots history into a feature film. This is very important work. This is going to be the next Sound of Freedom. Trust me. This is going to hit the historical itch that needs to be scratched, the same way Sound of Freedom hit the topic of child trafficking, the same way Passion of the Christ hit the issue of Jesus's resurrection, death and resurrection. So help us make this. Go to Wild World of History, watch the trailer, and buy Larry a coffee. And I'll see you guys back here next time.